first time with masks and everything else. I haven't given a public seminar for a couple years. So anyway, I put some of the slides up or seminars up here that we're going to start with. Next week we've got working.
Mute.
Okay. So start over. Next week, we've got Matt Ederson talking about hawks. And then we've got another talk about birds. And you can find the rest of the schedule on the department website. Let's see. And one of the things that I did, just out of curiosity, was my first time as a seminar committee chair of one. So I kind of said, what's happened over the years in terms of presentations? And so this semester, what you'll see is a variety. And I've got on the left-hand side, that's since 2012. And on the right-hand side, I've got this fall, because I was kind of curious how we would compare, just out of curiosity. And later in the semester, you'll see some graduate student defenses. And those are kind of, for those of you moving on to grad school, that's the culmination after 2 to 4 years of work. The UMD faculty have got about 20%, and I'm one of those. Nobody else wanted to go first, so that's what happened. External faculty, about 40% overall. We're a little bit lower, and that's mainly because of COVID. We had one guy who canceled because of COVID, so we're down there. And then agency people like DNR or US Forest Service. And then we've got a couple of postdocs this year. So after we get our PhD, then we go on to a postdoc before we can get a real job. And that's, it's actually pretty good because you don't have a lot of faculty responsibilities. So, so that is the introduction. And then since I'm the seminar committee chair, Julie offered to introduce me, but I didn't want to stand up, sit down, and sit up. So I'll introduce myself. I'm faculty here. Some of you are in my class this fall. And I also have an appointment up at NRI. And that's a applied research institute at UMD. And we do environmental type work. We also do some mining and wood products type work. But my work is obviously, well, not obviously, but it's all with mammal type things. Title of my talk today, Future of Moose in Minnesota, What We Learned, actually should be reversed, because I'm going to first talk about the things that we learned. And then I'm going to talk about the future. Okay, so there's kind of 3 major players in this. And on the top, obviously, is moose. They're a northern species. And by a northern species, what I mean is that their range, they go about as far south as just into Minnesota. And they go further south in the mountains and out east. And the talk can't just be about moose because other species affect them. And one species is white-tailed deer. I should ask my mammalogy students what that is, but they should know. Most of you should know. And white-tailed deer are important for 2 reasons. And the first reason is because they are an alternative food source for wolves. And that can keep the wolf population higher. But probably a more important reason is that white-tailed deer carry diseases that very negatively affect moose. And some of my graduate students have worked on them. And then the third major player is the gray wolf. And the wolf is important. Well, you'll see as I talk about it why, but basically the simple reason is because they eat moose. And we are concerned about moose because over the last 5 to 10 years, we've had well, actually it's 2020. Over the last 15 years, we've had a 50% drop in the population in Minnesota. And that spurred a fair bit of research. And let's see, the Zoom thing up top is kind of covering it, but we started with, decline first started to be noticed in the early 2000s. And so there was what's called the collars are VHF. So they send signals out, you have to fly around and find them. And it was about 150, 150, I remembered it. In about 2010, I started getting involved along with, there's a lot of people, let's see, you can't quite see it, I'll have to read it. Voyageurs National Park, Quetico Provincial Park in Canada, Grand Portage Indian Reservation, 1854 Treaty Authority, and Fond du Lac. We put out about 75 collars. And then in 2012, the DNR got involved and they put out about 200 collars. So there's been, essentially there's a lot of work that's been done on moose. And these are a couple of examples of collars. They look big, they are kind of heavy, but how big is a moose? Yeah. So they can easily carry them. And this is a moose wearing a GPS collar. And this one is actually a little bit bigger. The different groups have used different manufacturers of collars as technology has improved. And one of the key things about GPS collars is that they record the locations of the animal and they record it continuously, well, almost continuously. You know, when you think about a VHF collar transmitting, you get a location once a week, once a month, especially if you have to fly because of the cost. With the GPS collars, they cost more initially. They have some technical difficulties sometimes, but we got locations every 20 minutes. And so imagine knowing how an animal is going for an entire year. And that's actually what you see here. So this is one moose, 20-minute locations, and we got almost 100% locations. And so we know exactly where these animals are going and what they're doing. And it's almost too much data. You know, when you think about, if I remember right, I should have checked 34,000 locations a year times 50 moose. You know where these animals are going and what they're doing. And what we did is, I'm gonna first go through a few of the things that my graduate students have done over the years. Because it actually is, I was thinking quite a while. Amanda started in 2010. And one of her projects was using what's called the black globe to measure temperatures. It's a better measure of the temperature that you're experiencing. Because it doesn't, basically the radiation, infrared radiation and all that comes in correctly. And a thermometer that's on a regular bulb will heat up too much, for example, if it shines in the sun. And one of the key things, I'm gonna have to, the top part is hiding. You learn that with Zoom, apparently. So anyway, Amanda McGraw did this. This was back in 2010. And one of the key things that she found that we could then later test with the GPS collars is how temperatures are different depending on the habitat type. So if it's real hot outside and moose are heat sensitive, then they would tend to go towards conifer and mix, or not conifer and mix, yeah, because they'd be the cooler. As we'll see in a couple slides, they'll also go to the bog for a different reason. You can probably guess. And the other thing that she did, so she had 2 chapters in her thesis, was look at calving behavior. Now we've got locations every 20 minutes and it's almost 100%. And she was the first to discover this, and then it was used by the DNR in their later, the calving projects I'll talk about, that they make a long distance movement just before calving, you know, for some reason, you know, maybe what it might be to get away from predators, to move to a new area. But this movement happened in almost all 85% of the cows, and average 19 hours, but the longest was 85 hours, almost 3 days that she moved. And it's not a continuous walk, but it's an increase in speed. In the 10 kilometers on average, but up to almost 200 kilometers. That was probably the 85-hour movement. And the average movement rate was 9 meters per minute. That's why we knew it was different compared to when they're just actually just living about 2 meters per minute is how far fast they move. And so this was used by the DNR in their calving study. And currently, you can't see her name either, but Valerie is working on this data still. And it's like when you have a couple million locations, you got plenty of work to do. And so Valerie is looking at this in a better way. Amanda looked at basically the GPS locations, but the other thing we have on these collars is activity counters. So how many of you have a Fitbit or an Apple Watch? You know, yeah, it's the same thing on a moose, except for it's on its neck instead of on its wrist. And so this is how they move based on the activity counter. So we've gotten rid of all the times when they're bedded. And one of the curious things she found, fall, winter, and spring, the longer the belt duration, the speed increases, but then summer is higher. Now, why would that be? Because they're getting their most food. That's when they're feeding. They're taking 15 to 20,000 bites a day. And imagine doing that, just walk, walk, walk. And that actually is what Rachel worked on. So Rachel Ward she was a 2013, and we had these GPS tracks and said, what can we learn about moose? And so they come from satellites. I neglected to say that initially. It's basically a cell phone in a collar. And so she would get a location of a moose, go to that location, and then walk exactly where that moose walked and count the bites. So that's why it's not really diet composition, because that would be more of a cumulative across the winter type thing, but within a foraging belt. And when I look at this, you probably can't read all the names. I can't because I don't have my glasses on, but what you see is variation. You know, moose in general, if you look in the literature, eat 5 or 6 browse species make up 80 to 90% of their diet. And that's about what you see here, but what you don't see is how animals are responding individually. And we're also seeing something very similar in terms of habitat use that I'm not going to talk about today. And it's both females, and then we had a couple males collared. This would be more the kind of the diet, because it's looking at multiple animals across space. In hazel and paper birch, for the botanists here, are a couple of species that are eaten. Now moose, like when I started, I said that they were a northern species and they're heat sensitive, but that's not quite the full story because of deer. So Nick McCann, he was a postdoc actually, and he did a study on respiration rate. And they start increasing their respiration rate at about 68 degrees. You know, we don't when we're sitting down in the sun or anything like that. And then when it gets up to about 90 degrees, that's what that is, they're at 100 to 120 breaths per minute. And why would they do that? Because they don't sweat. They have no sweat glands. And so that's behaviorally one thing they can do. Another thing is habitat selection. If you go back to Amanda when I was talking about the bogs, they're wet. And the next slide also illustrates that. So it's almost like you could think of a moose as a dog in some cases. And you've seen dogs in hot weather, and that's essentially what they have to do. Okay, and another thing Nick did, so this is Nick again, was look at the bed sites. Because we had these 20-minute locations, we could identify bed sites. They'll bed for about an hour and a half to 2 hours on average. And that gives you what? 2 hours would be 20 minutes, 6 locations, a cluster. And then you go to the cluster, and what Nick did was he measured the, among other things, the water content underneath. And wet bed sites under hotter conditions had higher water content. So who remembers basic physics? Hi, that's a no from faculty member. Basic physics, a high specific heat of water. And so essentially what the animal is doing is it's laying down, you've got a thermal window, we'll learn about that in mammalogy, a thermal window on the belly with very little hair, and it's transferring heat right down into the ground. And the other complication here, you can think of moose are ruminants. About 10% of their body weight is their gut. And it's like a fermentation vat. And fermentation creates heat. So it's really kind of neat how they do that. When I was up in Alaska, I'd go up and touch a moose bed, hot. I actually measured. And they really do transfer heat down. And the other things, canopy closure was high during the day, so they're not getting solar radiation, and lower at night because they can lose heat to the sky. And they used openings more at night than during the day, which is as you would expect. Another student, Bryce Olsen, he expanded on Amanda's work and applied it at like a landscape level. So if you measure the temperature in different cover types with these black globes, so the same thing, then you can say this is what the temperature is in a red pine stand and a white pine stand and those types of things. Color coded here, so these are the areas that moose would tend to avoid. The darker green, they would go to when it was hot weather. That would be a prediction. We never tested this. Although he tested opportunistically on a few locations, but it's very computationally intensive. It's not worth doing for too much. I wish he'd have done a little bit more, but you know, when you're a grad student, you go on in your job, then you don't always finish things up. And then Amanda came back to do a PhD. And what she did on the PhD was basically collared white-tailed deer and collared moose. And this was to identify habitats that they both use. If we're going to do management to increase the moose population or help it, we want to know where these potential mortality factors are. And the next set of slides talks about those mortality factors. So I'm a little bit ahead of myself. But the important thing here is that because we had GPS collars on moose and deer in the same place, we'd say these are the habitats that they're using. And this is where potential risk of disease transmission is highest, all of these red areas. Oh, I forgot. So we took advantage of the samples and did a little foray into genetics, which I'll just say a couple things about it. But Jared Strasberg and I co-advised Tessa on this, and we had blood samples from moose from all over Minnesota. And the bottom line is that they're essentially a pan-mictic population. I think that's the right genetic pattern. So there's really no structure in the moose population genetically. It's different from, we also co-advised Jessica Rick on wolves, and wolves are structured genetically. So there's differences there, even though they're in the same areas. And then we got to diseases and parasites. So Tim Sir worked on snails and slugs. And this is one of the more important ones, as you'll see. Essentially, the parasites are, the normal host is deer. And the deer, when they, I don't know how to say it correctly, it slipped my mind, when they poop, that's not biologically correct, but I forgot. When they poop, the snails crawl over the pellets and they pick up this P. tenuis, which is hiding under here. P. tenuis is a parasite in deer that it basically goes around the dural matter on the spine, on the brain. So it doesn't affect them at all. It doesn't climb in it or affect them. It gets into moose, and one worm will dig into the brain for some reason. And so it's often fatal, not always fatal to moose, but it's often enough, as you'll see, that it is of concern. Now, what Tim found was not unusual here. The infection rate of P. tenuis in snails was 0.17%, very low. This is one of the big things where the snails and slugs were more common, and also reproduction led to a density increase over the summer. But the critical thing is this here. So with that infection rate in snails, a moose or a deer, a moose would have to eat 500 snails in order to get infected. Now, our moose snail eaters? No, it's a mystery. The only thing we can think of, and we being the collective moose community, is that moose are picking them up in the fall when they're eating leaf litter. There was a few things about they're picking them up when, like, they're essentially, the infected snails are more likely to climb up a shrub because it affects their mobility. But Tim tested that too, and it wasn't the case. So deer need to eat 1,000 snails because they need two. They need to have two of the same sex to mate. So the P. tenuis. So it really is a mystery. You know, how do they eat that many snails? Okay, Julianne Terry also got it. Yeah, that's a disgusting picture, but this is biology. So she worked on winter ticks, and it's a good thing that winter ticks don't like people, because she went out with this tick drag and dragged for ticks. The most she ever found was, I think it's 1426, if I remember right, in one of those drags. This is a moose that died from winter ticks. The nice thing about what she did is that because we knew where these animals were in the spring and the fall, she could go out to where the ticks dropped off in the spring and then sample that same area in the fall and pick up this many ticks. So, and it's a little bit different. It's the ticks actually hang on to each other. So there'll be a cluster of a couple hundred, and one of them will grab onto a moose, and then all 200 of them climb on. So that's how you can get something like the tick load. I mean, your skin will crawl, but 50,000 to 80,000 ticks on an individual animal. And the other thing that she found was the moose would drop them off in the spring, and then they'd revisit the same area in the fall. So that was a way for that tick population basically to sustain itself. Now, looks gross, it happens. The thing about ticks, at least in Minnesota, is that our winters are bad enough that they haven't been a real problem in the past. A problem for this is moose, yes. But at the population level, if they drop off in snow, the females have a low survival rate. So to date, it's not a problem, but what about with climate change? You know, the times when moose have problems with winter ticks are when there's early snow melt And it's happened in about 1990 and in 2013 when this picture was taken. So it's not a real problem with an asterisk yet. And then Trevor Bonata, he did his master's here. He's actually given a seminar about a month, and he worked on another parasite. Limnaeid scales, they're aquatic and they carry it. Looked at infection rate in deer. This is another deer parasite that comes into moose. And he also did a review of their status. And so it's called a giant liver fluke for a reason, 3 inches long. Mammals can function despite losing a lot of liver function. And so some of the livers, this is a deer, but on moose are like 50%. It's liver flukes, and it's not a biological term, the mess associated with them. But they're still looking perfectly healthy. So this is kind of a bad thing from a visual perspective, but it's not, doesn't seem to be killing moose. And that was that's all stuff that my graduate students have worked on, and it kind of builds into the larger picture. The DNR in their study, cause of death. Why are adult moose dying? You can see there's a range of causes here, the biggest being parasites, and that would be what I just went through. And bacterial infection was different. And then wolves. So wolves, you got to be careful about though, because it's proximate versus ultimate. I forgot to point that out, but so the immediate cause of death, if you were to look at an animal in the field, 65% is health related, which is not so good. And 30% is predator or wolf related.
Run it.
But when you look at the animals killed by wolves, there's a lot of health related problems associated with it if you get there quick enough. If you don't get there quick enough, that's all that they found. And that's this category. And I guess all of us would probably agree that this category is probably pretty similar to that category. We just couldn't find the evidence. And so 75 to 90% of mortality is health related, ultimately. And about a quarter of them were brainworm that I mentioned, and about a quarter were this bacterial infection, which but sometimes that was because wolves tried to kill an animal and they clotted, opened up wounds. I'm not sure about the others. One other graduate student who picked up we helped, but we got about 1,000 wolf scats. And when you run the scats through a dishwasher and then put them under a microscope, you can tell moose calves. No, that's a moose calf, moose adult, and what you can tell a prey species composition. And so it varies across Minnesota. That's voyagers, more deer, and then the central area here. And then Grand Portage up in the tip had less deer and more moose. So a lot of this also varies geographically. The other thing we've done is look in the literature. So there's a lot of work that's been done on moose because people like them, and they're also a hunted species. 77 project years and 5,300 moose went into this table. And the important thing about it is that it varies from if you're in Alaska. So if you're up north, you're better. And as you move south, it gets a little bit worse, which is probably related to them being a northern species. But for Minnesota, areas around here, 80% of the adults get pregnant, and 24% of them have twins. And that's a composite of all the studies in this area. So if you take 100 cows, 80 of them will have twins, or have at least one calf, and then an additional 20 will have twins. They don't have triplet. Well, never say never, but almost never have triplets. So you'd have about one calf per cow in May on average. And this shows what's happened over time. So in 1980 to 2010, let's see, it looks like the heading is lost, but it's, this is a calf to cow ratio in January, February, when moose are counted. Or January, it says there. And so what do you see in the difference? Until 2005, you had a lot of high calf to cow ratios in January, high calf survival. After that, they pretty much don't exist. They're all down here in the low end. And so that gives you an indication of what the problem possibly is. So here's a couple of calves. In a Minnesota study, Bill Seaverwood and Glenn Delgevis, both DNR, put collars on calves to see what was killing them. They got in right away or as soon as possible. And like you can see, 80% of them about were wolves. So wolves are the big bad enemy here, apparently. And then bears will only kill calves for the first month or so. And after that, they're able to move and get away and one on no one. So basically about 90% from predation and then some accidents. And then the other thing, 18 days was a median age. So they're killing a lot of young calves before they can move. And the last thing was most of the predation was by July 1st, which is similar. Okay, now I'm going to transition to part 2. So that's a lot of the background data. DNR does an annual aerial survey with the tribes. That's the area that's covered. And what I'm going to use is their population estimate and then the calf to cow and percent calf ratios. And I'm going to put that in a population model. So basically, you got moose on the ground, moose on the computer. They do exactly the same thing. They do it a little bit differently. So before birth, parturition, and then there's birth. So you have calves, yearlings, adults, summer, fall mortality, harvest if it happens. You do the survey, winter mortality, and then the calves become yearlings and the cycle continues. That's essentially what moose do on the ground. That's what I do in the computer. How good is it? Well, I think this is pretty good. The red dots are this line is a survey, and the green is my model approximation. So what I use, like I said, those 3 values, and then the literature for some things, and that's backed up by field data here out of Minnesota. And essentially, what I do is I adjust the calf survival rate. So if there's high calf survival, you'd expect a high calf to cow ratio. Reverse that, high calf to cow ratio. You'd expect high calf survival, and lower vice versa. You never get a perfect match, but essentially what I'm doing, I won't go into the details, but it's like linear regression, where you're trying to minimize the deviation from the line, except for it's a crooked line, as you can see. If I'm wrong, what happens? So here is an example. Let's say I went from the true, what I said was 40% survival for calves, and I actually put in 45. Within 4 years, I'm 1,500 moose off. So it's a good check on how this can work, or why it works. And another example, so it doesn't just work here in Minnesota. Well, the Voyageurs National Park is in Minnesota, but the same thing. Good match model, and the Mecca or Holy Grail for moose work is Isle Royal, and did the same thing and got the data from Ralph, and look at that. So hopefully you believe me, it works. Let's go back to Minnesota. I helped the DNR last fall with what would be the effective harvest on the current moose population. And essentially what we say is 50 bulls a year. You can kind of tell the difference out here. You can't early on. You take 150 and you see it right away, the effect. And we can also say, how can we learn, or how can we increase the population? So that's the basic survival rate. If we were to increase adult survival from 86 to 89, calf survival 41 to 57, then we would get back to where the population was. And because it's a model and it's based on individuals, we can say, all we would need is 110 more adults and 184 more calves to survive, which doesn't seem like much. And this is another version of that, but it includes, so how do we make that change? That's the baseline. We can make it by increasing habitat, which is hiding up here, increasing habitat quality, which we'll talk about, or we can make it by somehow increasing survival. And the bottom line is that increasing survival is probably more likely, but putting them together would also help. Okay, the culprit is here. Needs about 1 million kcals a year. It can get that from 3 adult moose. Now it can't refrigerate the moose, so it's not quite that simple. Or it can get it from about 45 calves, or it's 25 deer. And so that's kind of what we're working with. The second thing, how many wolves are there? I'm not going to go into the details of this, but basically 3 different estimates come up with about 500 wolves on moose range. So we take that, and we can look at what's happened over time. This is when moose were high, and then they had their decline. And this is the future, obviously. When moose were high, there was a lot of dead moose out there. And all of this is something like this. It was called a tip over back then, because it would look like a moose just tipped over and died, and nothing ate it. Now, with the low moose population, and we've still got the 500 wolves, if half of their diet is, it basically can't be from moose. 25% of their diet can be, and I got these 2 lines here because wolves don't kill everything. And I have quotes because predation in quotes because of what I showed earlier. If they're predisposed to dying, they're going to die anyway. So should we call it predation? But it's probably somewhere in here that the wolves out there are able to eat right now. So the second message from that is that deer are critical to maintaining the wolf population. They get half or more of their calories from deer. And there's a little bit of spatial variation, so it might be an oversimplification a little bit. And this is consistent with, here's Northeast Minnesota, about 30% moose in the diet. But look at this geographical pattern. West to east, and Isle Royale is the exception because there's no deer out there. But it's kind of neat how things like this work. Okay, wolves. We had a wolf harvest. Basically, wolves are protected under the Endangered Species Act, except for from, you can't see it up there, but it's 2012 to 2014. We had 3 years of harvest. In those 3 years, about 160 wolves were taken in wolf range. Yeah, 163, you can see that. And I think that that is related to what's happened to the moose population. So here's that decline. And we've had about 8 years of stability. And what's happened over those 8 years, there's multiple factors. Obviously, there always is. It's never simple. That wolf harvest on moose range occurred here over 3 years. And so you had less. One of the things is that it's not just the individual wolf that's harvested, but it's also the disruption to the social structure of the pack. And so you've had fewer wolves, and also their pack size, their territory size gets larger. So the effect on the moose is less. And this is conjecture, I should say. I haven't proved this, but it makes sense. And that's what our job is to kind of look at the biology and try and interpret. We also had a severe winter in 2014 that knocked back the deer population quite a bit. And that also caused additional food stress on the wolves so that they were in worse condition. And then the third thing is we've had, a lot of you have probably seen on the news about the Greenwood Lake fire. We've also had in the early 2000s, Ham Lake and Cavity Lake fires, bigger fires than the Greenwood Lake fire in moose range. And those areas are seeing higher moose reproduction and higher moose numbers. And the blowdown too happened. So that, I think, is why we've had this kind of period of stability. And what's going to happen in the future? Yeah, this just says the future up there. I got it. First time I've given a Zoom on a real or presentation on a real Zoom. So in the future, you know, the DNR, who is charged with managing moose, has got, well, they can try to satisfy everyone and they'll satisfy no one. Because, well, they'll satisfy someone maybe, but so managing deer, we don't have, essentially deer are managed by winters. They're already at an extremely, relatively low population across northeastern Minnesota. They're still able to transmit parasites to moose, even at those low levels. And that was one of the things that Amanda did in her PhD. So there's really not a lot that can be done there. They're already being managed pretty low. We can harvest wolves now because they're off the endangered species list. How many of you love wolves? I mean, there's lots of people out there that do. So that's not going to be something, but it's one of those things that, you know, if you want to, it's almost like you're being forced to have a choice between moose and wolves at some point. And it's a tough one. Bear impact is probably small enough. The bear population has gone down anyway in Minnesota, and it's at a lower level. So it's probably small enough. An exception is Grand Portage Indian Reservation. They've got a higher bear population. They've actually had a spring bear hunt to reduce. And that also, well, the other thing it does, because bears are hunted by baiting them into like piles of candy. So it draws the bears from the moose calves to the candy. So that might be an alternative solution. Put out bait piles for all across northeastern Minnesota. Not seriously. But and managing habitat, you know, there have been projects to increase moose browse, and they do respond. The browse does, and the moose. But they're relatively small compared to the fires that we're seeing. You know, and we had the same response of moose in the 1970s. There was a big fire, moose came in. And the elephant in the room, of course, is climate change. You know, what I've talked about so far is the short term, next 10, 20, 25 years. 40 years from now, when you guys are, some of you guys are my age, moose are probably not going to be in Minnesota anymore, and along with several other northern species. And then I wanted to end with one other thought, and of course, Zoom is hiding it. Expanding moose populations. There are some, and they are located here, here, and here. And some of them are traditional forested moose habitat, and others are agricultural like this. Can you imagine seeing a moose in a sunflower field or something like this? They quote, shouldn't be there, but they seem to enjoy it. And the thing about these areas where moose are expanding, which is why I started with, they're a northern animal, but they can be a more southern animal if predators aren't there. And that's none of these places. There's bears here, lower density. There's no wolves here. There's a few there, but this is more agricultural, so not. But what you can see is that moose can actually adapt to a warmer environment and live in it if they aren't stressed by predators. At least that's what seems to be the case. So that's last slide. Lots of support for this work because it was done over so many years, and there was lots of collaborators that I didn't mention. But it certainly has been fun to work with these animals. So I can take any questions, but let's see. Okay, and let's see. Yeah, that's what I was trying to say is how do I get the applause first? I need a better ending. The way we do it here every semester, because of 3987 and also because of other undergraduates who are interested, we start with questions from undergraduates. So does any one of you in 3987 have a question? Don't be shy. Yes.
I guess, did you ever notice, like, throughout all of this time, when you fix, if you notice if like calves or adults were more or less susceptible, or was it relatively the same?
Yeah, that's a good question. So winter ticks, calves or adults, are they more susceptible? And calves are much more susceptible because of their body size. You'll have mortality first in calves, and then the adults. Yearlings are kind of in the middle, but when you think of it, when you can pick up, it's like these clusters of ticks that all grab on. When you've got 50 to 80,000, even 100,000 ticks have been measured on, and it's a sampling the height. You don't count 100,000 ticks with thick moose hair. But sampling the height, 100,000 ticks, you're draining. You have to replace their blood almost entirely by the, and then that's why they die. So yes, for sure, body size is a factor. And the thing about moose, they have their guard hairs are that long, so they can't get in and groom. And so I didn't show any pictures of them, but they call them ghost moose because they rub off all their hair and they basically just have the underfur. Looks like wool. Anybody else? Yes.
How do you get close enough to the loose to put on the jackets?
Oh, yeah. It's actually kind of fun. I've got to do it a couple times. It's also it's a high risk job because almost always it's done by helicopters. And basically it's a lot of the people that work on it are cowboys from out west, unless they use drugs. And so sometimes they'll fly with a helicopter. I should have shown that video of that. Fly with a helicopter, shoot a net gun out, basically right over the top of them, and then hobble the animal. And in that case, you don't need to use drugs actually. You can just hobble the animal, get the collar on quick and go. Otherwise, you shoot them with a dart gun from a helicopter, and they're immobilized for about 60 minutes, and then you get the collar on. But in Massachusetts, actually, in an Isle Royal, they've done it by sneaking up on them because it's in shot. Not they don't put it up. No, that would be a challenge. So yeah, no, they sneak up and they shoot them with dart guns. How about one more question from an undergrad, and then we'll go to grad. Going. Oh, my glasses on, so I can't see. What is it? Oh, there.
Do they shed their antlers? Like, how often do they shed their antlers? And or do people go shed hunting for their antlers?
Yes, very, very much so. Yes, and yes. They shed their antlers. They usually drop them January into February. Sometimes they'll drop them earlier. That's one of the challenges with a survey is getting it done in time so that they can actually, be more sure of if it's a bull or a cow. And that's one reason why you might have seen I had a bull to cow column ratio on there too, but it's so variable, it's biologically impossible. So they could, for some reason, just as well not measure it. But yes, there is a dedicated community of shed hunters, and they used to look at this is where moose were harvested, maps and things like that, and go out there with dogs and everything to get them. I'm not sure. I guess you just have to like it because I don't think that valuable. Well, a couple $100, but still, it's more to be out in the woods. Okay, grad students. Yes.
I guess I have two questions. One, do moose have their own parasites? Like, is that a reason for health-related sickness?
The moose have their own parasites. Yes, they do, but I'm not a parasitologist, so I can't give you a list.
But it's not like you're finding moose that have died from a parasite that isn't from a human.
No, they don't, no, it's really, it is, and it's not just moose, it's also parrot. So on these, the parasites of deer, when they get up on these northern species, they negatively affect them.
And then I guess secondly, all of this has been done in the past. Is there any future projects that you are starting or?
Oh, future moose project. I'd like to, who wants, where can I find the money? No, there's a couple issues there, and one is that it's hard to work on moose right now unless you're on the Grand Portage Reservation because of Governor Dayton. He got, I don't know how to say it nicely. He was approached by some people who were against handling moose, and they successfully convinced him, and for some good reasons. Things could have been done better by the DNR, but they successfully convinced him to put a moratorium on any moose handling. And the Grand Portage Reservation can do it because they're obviously a sovereign nation. But there's lots of things that could be done with habitat, browse measurements, and those types of things too. Yes.
Is chronic wasting disease a concern for moose?
Chronic wasting disease. So most of you probably know it's affecting deer populations, like mad cow disease, the equivalent in humans. It has been detected in moose two or three times, so it's not really a factor. But it has been. I think one of them was in Alberta. Can't remember where the other one was. Okay, there's fewer grad students, so we can open it up to anyone, undergrads and grad students. Yes, in fact.
I like in like the wolf population, if you're manage like the increasing moose population by removing wolves, how might that affect like other prey populations such as like that?
That is one of the complicating factors is when if we reduce the wolves, then white-tailed deer populations, because of reduced pressure, could potentially increase, but they're so low already in that it would be a net benefit to moose. And this is speaking biologically. It's not from a social perspective or anything like that, but biologically, if we look at the data, it would be a net benefit to moose to reduce the wolf population. And that's like you saw the slides where 80% of the calf mortality was caused by wolves, and they're down to 40% survival. So that's a large number of calves. And for the adults, 30% were, and it's a little bit more complicated there because a lot of the moose that they're killing have parasites and diseases, but they probably have parasites and diseases that they could still function reproductively. So I'm sure that it would be a net benefit. What I've talked about with the DNR, if they can get permission, then that's the other thing, is that even though it's legally possible to harvest wolves now, in Wisconsin did it, for example, would it be something that DNR leadership and the public would be okay with? And what we've talked about is having like a control in an experimental area. So reduce wolves in one area, leave them in another, and detect a response, which would be a good way to show, does this method work or not? Yes.
I guess circling back to the others again, you said that the wolf lasts for about 6 months.
Yeah.
wait around if it's a calf, like you're more vulnerable, or wait till you get up. And do it. Is that just doing it?
If there were a calf, yes. Calves at that age are, so basically the collaring is done January to February, maybe into March. Calves at that age are semi-independent, but what they will do is stick around. To be honest with you, I don't know that, I know that we never went back to check. And it's not done, I haven't seen it done anywhere in the literature. It'd be a good thing to actually confirm, but at that age, they should be able to, like they hang around. A couple times we have seen them because, yeah, I should have showed that video so you could see, but basically, if you're collaring, you got the mom right here, the calves in front, because that's a defensive position, and then the helicopter's here. And so the calf can't go very far. So, but good question. Yeah.
Is there any concerns of predation or like lingering effects from the sedate outside of it?
Predation from lingering effects of the sedative. There really aren't. And again, I'll show, he's in my model, so he'll see it. It is absolutely amazing. They're drugged with carfentanil, which is a very powerful narcotic. The reversal agent, you put it in, and then they literally get up and walk away, fully functional. It's like 100% reversal. So there, in the old days, there might have been some of the drugs that we used, but with carfentanil and not, well, Trexone, I think it is. It's just amazing. All right, well, thanks for your attention. If you have any more questions, email me or come up.